Sergeant Kyle Mercer had always been meticulous. At Fort Hood, among the roar of engines, the smell of jet fuel, and the constant clatter of metal against metal, he was an observer more than a participant. While others moved quickly, checking off boxes on maintenance sheets, Kyle's eyes traced every bolt, every hydraulic line, every connection on the A-64 Apache helicopters he was assigned. The hangar was his cathedral, and the helicopters his sacred duty. To the other mechanics, he seemed obsessive, sometimes painfully slow, but Kyle didn't care. The machines didn't forgive mistakes, and neither did the pilots who trusted him with their lives. It was mid-afternoon when Kyle first noticed a thin, almost imperceptible glimmer of hydraulic fluid beneath the belly of one Apache. At first, he thought it might be a leftover from a routine top-up earlier in the week. But his instincts told him otherwise. This was subtle, but it was wrong. The flight log indicated the helicopter had been cleared for a morning sortie the next day. That meant the bird would carry a full crew of pilots and ground personnel, all relying on machines he maintained, into the sky. Kyle crouched low, flashlight in hand, following the tiny bead of fluid along the underside. The hangar smelled of oil, fuel, and metal polish, and the drone of other helicopters created a low hum in the background. He traced the leak back to a critical component, a main servo line that controlled the rotor's movement. This wasn't a minor issue. It was the lifeline of the helicopter's flight system. A failure here could mean catastrophic loss of control midder. As he examined the line, his mind flashed to the pilots who would be flying the machine tomorrow. Captain Rachel Torres, Lieutenant Mason Hall, and their co-pilot crews, all faces he had come to know by sight during previous missions. If something went wrong, if this line failed mid-flight, Kyle knew the outcome. Panic tightened his chest, but he forced himself to breathe. He had to remain calm, systematic. Kyle rose and headed toward the tool cabinet, his mind already racing through protocols. He grabbed a set of gauges, torque wrenches, and inspection mirrors, returning to the Apache with precision. Every movement was deliberate. He circled the helicopter, checking each hydraulic connector, tracing every line, and observing the tiniest vibrations or imperfections in the metal. Mechanics joked about his obsession, calling him Checklist Kyle, but deep down, even the ribbing held a trace of respect. Everyone knew Kyle's standards were the reason the Apaches rarely experienced failures during training or combat. By late afternoon, the sun had begun to dip through the hangar windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The other mechanics were leaving in small groups, talking loudly about off-base plans or weekend leave. Kyle stayed behind, oblivious to the chatter around him, focused entirely on the Apache. The tiny leak didn't just worry him, it unsettled him in a way he couldn't ignore. He pulled out the maintenance logs from the past week, cross-referencing each entry for the helicopter. 2 other minor leaks had been reported, both dismissed as false alarms. The pattern set off another alarm in his mind. These weren't coincidences. Something was being overlooked, or worse, dismissed to save time. Kyle's fingers hovered over his notepad as he jotted down observations, carefully noting timestamps, part numbers, and the precise location of the leak. Each detail could prove vital if an issue arose during flight. The hangar grew quieter, the sunlight fading into a soft orange glow. Kyle paused, wiping his hands on a rag, staring at the Apache like a general studying a battlefield map. He could imagine the sequence: takeoff, ascent, routine maneuvers, and then, mid-air, the servo line failing. In his mind's eye, the rotor would seize, the helicopter spiraling out of control, the cries of pilots echoing as the metal twisted violently. His stomach churned. 44 lives depended on this one machine tomorrow. 44. Kyle's mind wandered briefly to his family, his younger brother who had just enlisted, his mother who worried constantly, his father who always said, Precision saves lives. The words echoed now, as if guiding him. He knew he couldn't ignore this. His training, his instincts, and his conscience all converged on one point. Speak up. But how? Staff Sergeant Doyle, his immediate supervisor, was known for dismissing concerns that slowed operations. Escalating this could bring pushback, ridicule, or worse. Kyle had seen colleagues lose credibility for crying wolf. But this wasn't a hypothetical. This was real. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to step away for a moment. The hangar doors groaned as they shifted slightly in the evening breeze. Outside, the base seemed calm soldiers walking to their vehicles, distant engines humming, a normal day winding down. Yet Kyle couldn't shake the tension inside. The quiet weight of responsibility pressed against his chest. One small leak, one ignored detail, could end everything in minutes. He returned to the Apache and ran a final inspection. Everything was documented meticulously. Photographs of the line, detailed notes on the leak's location, measurements of pressure fluctuations, and comparisons with other units' readings. By the time he finished, the shadows in the hangar were long and heavy. Kyle sat on a low crate, exhausted but alert. He didn't eat dinner. He didn't call anyone. He only stared at the Apache, the faint glimmer of hydraulic fluid reflecting in the dim light, knowing that tomorrow, his actions or inaction could determine the fate of 44 lives. As the night deepened, Kyle began drafting a report. He wrote each word carefully, aware that this report could be ignored, or could be the reason people survived. He double-checked every figure, every photo, every note, making sure nothing was left to chance. He wasn't just a mechanic. In this moment, he was a sentinel, standing guard between life and disaster. Finally, Kyle leaned back, letting out a quiet sigh. The hangar was silent now, save for the soft hum of residual engine noise and the distant call of a guard. He knew that tomorrow would demand courage, not in a cockpit, not in a firefight, but in speaking the truth when others preferred comfort over safety. Kyle Mercer, the quiet one in the hangar, had made a choice. And though he didn't yet know it, that choice would save 44 lives. Kyle Mercer didn't sleep well that night. The hangar doors had long been locked, the last of the mechanics gone home, but the image of the tiny hydraulic leak haunted him. Every thought looped back to the same grim scenario. A malfunction mid-flight, spinning rotors, and pilots powerless against physics and metal. 44 lives hung in the balance. He traced the leak again in his mind, envisioning the fragile servo line under stress during maneuvers. The thought of it snapping mid-flight made his stomach churn, but he forced himself to stay calm. Panic would solve nothing. Only action could. Before dawn, Kyle returned to the hangar, flashlight in hand. The early morning air was cool and sharp, carrying the faint scent of oil and jet fuel. He examined the Apache again, meticulously inspecting the servo line, turning over hoses and connectors, listening for the subtle hiss of escaping hydraulic fluid. The leak was faint, almost invisible to an untrained eye, but Kyle's instincts screamed at him. It wasn't a minor anomaly. He grabbed a pressure gauge and connected it to the hydraulic system, monitoring readings for fluctuations. Each minor tremor in the lines made his heart jump. By mid-morning, Kyle knew he couldn't wait. He pulled the maintenance logs from the last 2 weeks. There it was, 2 prior reports of minor leaks in the same series of Apaches, dismissed as false alarms by other mechanics and supervisors. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't bad luck. It wasn't coincidence. It was a flaw either in maintenance oversight or a defect in the parts themselves. Kyle's mind raced. If this line failed during the upcoming exercise, multiple helicopters, flying in formation with 44 personnel on board, could be lost. He hesitated for a moment, weighing the consequences of his next move. Escalating the issue could bring ridicule, even disciplinary action. Staff Sergeant Doyle was notorious for dismissing concerns that slowed operations. Kyle knew that raising an alarm might brand him as paranoid or difficult. Yet, he couldn't ignore the truth. His responsibility wasn't to protect his reputation. It was to protect the lives of the pilots and crew. He scribbled his observations in a notebook, arranging photographs and readings meticulously. This wasn't paranoia. This was evidence. Kyle made his way to the supervisor's office, his boots echoing across the concrete floor. The hum of helicopters in the hangar seemed louder now, like a low warning signal. He knocked on Doyle's door, took a deep breath, and laid out his findings. "Sir, I believe the servo line on Apache 4B has a defect. I also found similar indications on Apaches 2A and 3C. If these fail during tomorrow's formation exercise, it could be catastrophic." Doyle leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a tight line forming on his forehead. "We replaced that line yesterday. It passed inspection. Stop overthinking this, Mercer. You're worrying about nothing." The birds cleared for flight. "Move on." His tone was sharp, final. But Kyle wasn't ready to accept that. He showed Doyle the photos, the readings, the cross-references with previous maintenance reports. Doyle glanced briefly, then waved him off. "I said move on. You're making this a bigger deal than it is." Kyle left the office, heart pounding, frustration and fear warring inside him. He knew that ignoring this was not an option. The upcoming exercise involved 5 Apaches flying in close formation, a precision drill with 44 lives counting on every rotor, every hydraulic line, every mechanic's attention to detail. Even a minor failure in one helicopter could set off a chain reaction. Kyle's gut told him that the risk was real, immediate, and severe. He returned to the hangar, pacing, hands running through his hair as he contemplated his next steps. His mind flashed to the pilots, Captain Rachel Torres, Lieutenant Mason Hall, and their co-pilots. All trained, skilled, and unaware of the invisible danger creeping through their machines. If the servo line failed, there would be no warning, no time to react. Kyle's hands trembled as he picked up a clipboard and began drafting an urgent report. Every word mattered. Every detail could tip the scales between life and death. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, casting stark light through the hangar windows. Kyle conducted another thorough inspection, this time measuring torque on all related hydraulic connectors, checking fluid viscosity, listening for subtle hiss, vibration, or pressure fluctuations. Each line was scrutinized, documented, photographed. The pattern confirmed his fears. The leak wasn't an isolated incident. It was systemic. Something was wrong in the very parts used to keep these helicopters airborne. The realization weighed heavily on him. This wasn't about reputation, deadlines, or even compliance. It was about survival. 44 lives rested, unknowingly, on his knowledge, diligence, and courage. The other mechanics, engrossed in routine checks and banter, remained oblivious. They joked about rushing tasks to beat the noon roll call, unaware of the invisible danger hovering above them in the rotors and hydraulics of their own machines. Kyle felt the immense burden of responsibility settle on his shoulders, heavier than any metal beam he had ever tightened. By late afternoon, Kyle made his decision. He would escalate this, even if it meant defying his supervisor. He approached Captain Torres, a decorated pilot known for her precision and courage, explaining the findings with urgency, showing her the evidence he had painstakingly compiled. Her eyes narrowed as she reviewed the photographs and readings. Kyle could see the shift from skepticism to alarm. When she ordered a grounding of the helicopter, engines powering down in the hangar, he felt a mix of relief and tension. relief that action was being taken, tension because there were still more helicopters and more lives at stake. The investigations that followed confirmed Kyle's warnings. The main servo line had a microscopic defect, under flight stress, could fail catastrophically. Similar defects were identified in other helicopters scheduled for tomorrow's exercise. A chain reaction that could have claimed 44 lives had been avoided, all because one mechanic refused to remain silent. Kyle, the quiet one in the hangar, had seen what others didn't or refused to see. His insistence on precision, documentation, and courage under pressure had saved lives. That night, Kyle sat on a low crate in the now empty hangar, exhaustion pressing down like a lead weight. He had no desire for recognition or accolades. All he wanted was the quiet assurance that the pilots he had saved would fly safely, return home to their families, and continue serving. For the first time, the nickname Checklist Kyle didn't sting. It symbolized vigilance, responsibility, and courage, the very qualities that had made him the guardian of 44 lives, unseen and uncelebrated until now. As he finally left the hangar, the cool night air brushing against his face, Kyle's thoughts were simple but profound. One person's attention to detail, one voice speaking up, could be the difference between life and death. And tomorrow, as helicopters lifted into the sky, every rotor would spin safely, every pilot alive, all because he refused to ignore the faintest glimmer of danger. The hangar was eerily quiet that evening, the hum of idle helicopters fading into the background as shadows stretched across the concrete floor. Kyle Mercer leaned against a workbench, clutching his clipboard like a lifeline. His hands shook not from fatigue, but from the gravity of the situation. 44 lives hung in the balance, and he was the only one who had seen the danger clearly. Every minute that passed, every second he hesitated, made him question whether speaking up would truly make a difference. He stared at the Apache again, its sleek black frame gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. To anyone else, it was just another helicopter, ready for the next training exercise. But to Kyle, it was a ticking time bomb. The main servo line, a microscopic crack hidden beneath layers of metal and hydraulic fluid, could fail at any moment under stress. The consequences were unthinkable, a helicopter spinning out of control midair, pilots powerless to correct it, and 44 souls caught in the disaster. Kyle's mind replayed the morning's conversation with Staff Sergeant Doyle. "Stop overthinking this, Mercer," Doyle had said, dismissing the evidence as paranoia. But Kyle knew better. The pattern of leaks, the faint hissing of hydraulic fluid, the subtle vibration in the line, all of it pointed to the same undeniable truth. The helicopters were unsafe. The exercise was scheduled for tomorrow, and every second wasted in bureaucracy was another second closer to potential catastrophe. He pulled out his laptop and cross-referenced maintenance reports from other Apaches in the fleet. There it was again, a series of minor leak reports, all dismissed as false alarms. He felt a wave of frustration, anger, and helplessness. How many times had someone else ignored a warning, assuming it would pass unnoticed? How many times had caution been sacrificed for speed, for convenience, for the illusion of efficiency? Kyle knew the answer. Too many. And this time, the cost would be real. The hangar doors creaked as a few remaining mechanics wandered past, exchanging casual jokes and stretching tired muscles. They had no idea what Kyle had discovered, nor did they understand the burden he carried. Some laughed at his obsession with minor details. Others shrugged it off. But Kyle couldn't join them. His focus was fixed on the helicopter, the line, the invisible danger that could explode at any moment. The weight of silence pressed on him like a physical force, threatening to crush his thoughts, cloud his judgment, and freeze him in place. He tried to calm himself, taking deep breaths, reviewing his inspection notes again. Each measurement, Each photograph, each observation was meticulously documented. If anyone dismissed his concerns tomorrow, at least there would be evidence. The hydraulic line, numbered and catalogued, was carefully circled in red on his schematic diagrams. He even prepared a step-by-step explanation of how a failure would propagate through the system, the domino effect that could spin a helicopter out of control. It was more than a report. It was a life-or-death blueprint. Kyle's internal debate raged. Escalate the issue and risk punishment, or ignore it and risk death. Military culture wasn't kind to those who questioned authority, especially mechanics challenging the judgment of supervisors. He could already imagine the consequences: reprimands, accusations of insubordination, whispers in the barracks about overly cautious Mercer. But he also knew the truth. If he didn't speak up, tomorrow's flight could end in tragedy. 44 lives were counting on him, not as a pilot, not as a commander, but as the only person willing to see the danger and act. The night stretched on, and Kyle continued his preparations. He reviewed emergency procedures, highlighting the sequence of steps pilots would need if the servo line failed mid-flight. He ran simulations in his mind, a helicopter ascending, the rotor beginning to stutter, alarms blaring in the cockpit. He imagined the split-second decisions pilots would have to make. He pictured the young soldiers and their families there, lives intertwined with a machine that was not as reliable as it seemed. His chest tightened at the thought, and yet he refused to turn away. Around midnight, the hangar grew colder, shadows deepening into pools of darkness around the parked helicopters. Kyle sat on a low crate, fatigue threatening to overtake him, but he refused to rest. His thoughts oscillated between fear and determination. He thought about his own family, his younger brother, fresh out of basic training, and his parents who had raised him to value honesty, integrity, and responsibility. They would want him to act, to speak the truth, no matter the personal cost. And so he stayed, documenting every detail, reviewing his notes, and mentally rehearsing how he would confront the problem in the morning. The weight of silence was almost suffocating. He felt the burden of being the only person who saw the risk, the only one who could prevent disaster. Others would go home, sleep peacefully, oblivious to the danger lurking beneath the Apache's sleek exterior. Kyle couldn't. His mind spun with calculations, probabilities, and worst-case scenarios. 44 lives. The number repeated like a drumbeat in his skull, relentless, insistent, unforgiving. As dawn approached, Kyle prepared his materials for escalation. He organized his photos, graphs, and notes into a logical sequence that could be presented to someone in command. He rehearsed his words: precise, factual, urgent. No emotion, no hysteria, just truth. He knew that to be heard, he had to be methodical, authoritative, and impossible to dismiss. He would not leave the hangar without alerting someone capable of grounding the helicopters, even if it meant going over his supervisor's head. First light of day crept through the hangar windows, casting long shadows over the helicopters. Kyle glanced at the fleet one last time, his eyes lingering on the Apache with the defective servo line. He felt a mixture of fear, responsibility, and determination. Today, he realized, was not about speed, efficiency, or reputation. It was about courage, the quiet, unwavering courage to speak up when the stakes were unimaginably high. The weight of silence had been crushing him for hours, but now it was transforming into resolve. Kyle left the hangar briefly to gather his courage and plan his approach. He would need to find a pilot, someone willing to trust a mechanic's warning over standard protocol. Captain Rachel Torres had the reputation for precision and decisiveness. She would listen. Doyle might dismiss him again, but Torres could halt the exercise if she understood the danger. Kyle's steps were measured, each one taking him closer to a confrontation that could define the day and possibly save 44 lives. By the time he returned to the hangar, the sun had risen fully, casting bright light over the gleaming helicopters. Mechanics had begun arriving for pre-flight checks, unaware of the invisible threat among them. Kyle tightened his jaw, gripped his clipboard, and prepared himself. Words would be his weapon, evidence his shield. Today, he would no longer remain silent. The weight of responsibility had transformed into action, and Kyle Mercer, the quiet mechanic, was ready to confront the danger that no one else could see. The morning sun rose over Fort Hood like a warning, casting long shadows across the tarmac. The hum of helicopter engines filled the air, blending with the shouts of pilots and crew preparing for the day's exercises. 5 AH-64 Apaches lined up in formation, their rotors spinning in synchronization, stirring dust and anticipation. Kyle Mercer's heart pounded as he sprinted across the flight line, clipboard clutched tightly in his hands. Every step was heavy with urgency. Every second mattered. 44 lives were counting on him to be heard before it was too late. He shouted at the top of his lungs, hoping to pierce the roar of the rotors. "Is there an Apache pilot on base?" Heads turned. Some of the younger mechanics stared in confusion, unsure what to make of his frantic gestures. A few smirked, thinking it was another overzealous alarm from Checklist Kyle. But then he saw her captain Rachel Torres, her flight helmet tucked under one arm, walking with the confidence and precision that had earned her the respect of the entire base. Her eyes narrowed, recognizing the urgency in his voice. Kyle ran to her, panting slightly, trying to explain the situation before the helicopters lifted. "Captain Torres," he said, voice shaking with adrenaline, "the servo line on Apache 4B is defective. I've documented it, cross-referenced similar issues on other helicopters. If it fails mid-flight, the aircraft could spin out of control. We're talking 5 helicopters, 44 personnel. Please don't take off." Torres studied him intently, her eyes scanning the clipboard, then the photographs of the microscopic crack, the pressure readings, and the maintenance logs. Her jaw tightened. Kyle could see the shift in her expression's skepticism, giving way to alarm, and then to decisive resolve. She immediately radioed the tower and the exercise coordinator. "All units hold position. Stand down. We have a potential critical maintenance issue." The roar of engines abruptly cut as pilots halted their takeoff sequences. Dust hung in the air, the spinning rotors slowing to a stop. The commanding officer, a tall, imposing man with a reputation for efficiency, stormed onto the tarmac, his face red with frustration. What is going on here? Why are the helicopters still grounded? His eyes landed on Kyle. And who's responsible for this disruption? Kyle swallowed hard, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "Sir, I am Sergeant Kyle Mercer, Maintenance. I inspected Apache 4B and discovered a critical defect in the main servo line. It's part of a batch with previous similar failures. If the aircraft takes off, it could fail in flight. I documented everything." The commanding officer's gaze shifted to Captain Torres, who nodded subtly. "Sir, Mercer is correct. This is not a minor issue," she said, her tone commanding attention. "We cannot risk flight until the defect is confirmed and addressed." The commanding officer's lips pressed into a thin line. He was not used to being challenged, especially by a mechanic, but the evidence was undeniable. A team of engineers was called in to inspect the grounded helicopter. Kyle followed, clutching his clipboard and notes, heart still hammering. He observed silently as they conducted a full examination, checking every hydraulic line, every connector, every possible point of failure. When they reached the servo line, one engineer frowned. This shouldn't pass inspection," he muttered, examining the microscopic crack. Another engineer corroborated the finding, confirming Kyle's fears. The defect was real, and it could have catastrophic consequences if left unnoticed. Kyle felt a mixture of relief and tension. Relief that the helicopters were grounded and the danger identified. Tension because there were still other aircraft with similar parts, and the exercise had to be paused until inspections were complete. 44 lives had already been at risk, and the realization weighed heavily on him. He had spoken up, but the stakes had never felt higher. The commanding officer turned to Kyle, his expression unreadable. "Sergeant Mercer, you understand the risk of escalating this without prior authorization?" Kyle nodded. "Yes, sir. But the risk to personnel outweighed the risk to protocol." Torres added, "His actions saved lives today." "That is a fact." The commanding officer's jaw tightened again, but there was a grudging acknowledgement in his eyes. Sometimes courage came from unexpected places. Word spread quickly across the base. Mechanics who had once mocked Kyle now looked at him with newfound respect. His peers, who had laughed at his obsession with detail, realized that what they considered overcautiousness had prevented a disaster. Kyle, however, didn't feel pride yet. He was focused on ensuring the safety of the remaining helicopters, reviewing maintenance logs, and preparing to brief engineers on additional inspections. He glanced at the helicopter that had sparked the alarm. The small crack in the servo line, now clearly visible under inspection lights. The faint shimmer of hydraulic fluid that had first caught his attention seemed almost symbolic, a tiny signal that, if ignored, could have ended lives. Kyle's attention to detail, his refusal to remain silent, had made the difference. He had become, in that moment, the sentinel standing between life and disaster. Captain Torres walked alongside him, her helmet tucked under one arm, her gaze steady. "Kyle," she said quietly, "you did the right thing. Your vigilance saved lives today. Remember that. Never doubt it." Kyle nodded, feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't about recognition. It was about responsibility, and about the quiet courage required to speak truth in the face of doubt and bureaucracy. Engineers continued inspecting the other helicopters, identifying similar defects in the batch. The exercise was postponed, and maintenance teams worked tirelessly to replace faulty parts. Kyle remained on the tarmac, taking notes, overseeing inspections, and answering questions. He felt the tension gradually ease as the scope of the problem became clear and manageable. 44 lives, once at risk, had been preserved. And it all began with one mechanic daring to speak up, despite the weight of authority and expectation. By midday, the immediate danger had been contained. The helicopters were grounded for further checks, the pilots safe, and the commanding officer reluctantly acknowledging the importance of Kyle's actions. Mechanics and engineers worked alongside him, reviewing every detail, ensuring that no other aircraft would take to the sky with the same invisible threat. Kyle finally allowed himself a deep breath. He had faced the weight of silence, acted despite it, and emerged on the side of life. As the sun climbed high above the base, Kyle stood back and watched the Apaches from a distance. The rotors were still, the helicopters grounded, but the sense of impending disaster had lifted. He knew the day wasn't over, the inspections had to continue, but for the first time, he felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing one's diligence had prevented tragedy. 44 lives were still intact, their future unbroken. All because he had refused to remain silent, all because he had acted when it mattered most. The hangar had transformed from a place of routine into a hive of urgency. Engineers and senior mechanics swarmed around the grounded Apaches, their faces tense, eyes scanning, measuring, and documenting every detail. Kyle Mercer remained at the center of the storm, clipboard in hand, heart pounding as he watched the team validate what he had discovered. Every click of a gauge, every careful inspection, confirmed the unthinkable. The main servo line on Apache 4B was defective. The microscopic crack he had spotted wasn't just a fluke, it was a critical failure waiting to happen. As engineers moved from helicopter to helicopter, inspecting the other aircraft in the formation, the scale of the problem became clear. Several of the Apaches carried the same defective part, a critical component responsible for controlling rotor movement. If these aircraft had taken off in the morning's planned exercise, the results could have been catastrophic. 44 lives, pilots, co-pilots, and crew were hanging in the balance, all unknowingly riding machines that could fail in midair. Kyle stood slightly apart, observing without interruption. Relief and tension warred within him. Relief that the inspections were underway, that the helicopters were grounded, and that the danger had been caught. Tension because there were still so many lives at risk until every single Apache was cleared. His meticulous attention to detail, often mocked by his peers, had become the critical line of defense. He realized the weight of responsibility he carried, not just for one aircraft, but for the lives of every soldier who trusted his work. Captain Rachel Torres joined him at the side of the first helicopter. Her eyes scanned the cracked servo line with the precision of someone trained to spot danger. She shook her head slightly, disbelief etched on her face. "Kyle, you were right," she said quietly. "This could have ended badly, very badly. We owe you." Kyle shook his head. Recognition wasn't what he wanted. The thought of the disaster that had been narrowly avoided weighed heavier on his mind than any praise. Still, hearing those words from a pilot of her caliber gave him a quiet sense of validation. The engineers documented every defect, photographing the cracked lines, recording measurements, and cataloging serial numbers. It became evident that the flawed parts came from a single batch supplied by an external contractor. Further testing confirmed what Kyle had suspected. The material was substandard, prone to failure under the stress of normal flight operations. This wasn't a maintenance oversight. It was a systemic flaw that could have claimed lives on multiple missions. Kyle's observations had prevented disaster, and now the evidence was irrefutable. The commanding officer arrived, his expression a mixture of frustration and relief. "Sergeant Mercer," he said, voice tight, "I understand you escalated this issue despite initial pushback from your chain of command. Can you walk me through your findings?" Kyle nodded, speaking clearly, presenting his documentation, photographs, and data. Every detail, every note, every photo he had meticulously collected over the past 2 days became a story of vigilance and duty. By the time he finished, the commanding officer's tone had shifted, a grudging respect replacing his initial irritation. Word spread quickly across the base. Mechanics who had previously mocked Kyle now regarded him with awe and newfound respect. Some of the younger soldiers whispered among themselves, recounting how he had refused to ignore a faint glimmer of hydraulic fluid, a detail many would have dismissed. Even Staff Sergeant Doyle, initially dismissive, had been forced to acknowledge the significance of Kyle's observations. The entire maintenance team now saw him in a different light, not as an obsessive perfectionist, but as someone whose vigilance had prevented tragedy. Kyle's mind, however, remained focused on the bigger picture. The defective parts had to be replaced across the fleet. Inspections had to be completed on every Apache, ensuring no other aircraft could take to the skies with similar faults. He coordinated with engineers and senior mechanics, reviewing protocols, prioritizing replacements, and documenting the work meticulously. The day that had begun as routine maintenance had transformed into a full-scale safety operation. And through it all, Kyle remained calm, his focus unbroken despite the intensity surrounding him. As the inspections continued, Kyle reflected on the chain of events that had led to this moment. The tiny shimmer of hydraulic fluid he had noticed in the hangar had been the first clue, a whisper of danger almost invisible to the untrained eye. His decision to stay late, document everything, and follow the trail of evidence had saved lives. The realization that 44 soldiers were alive because of his diligence pressed heavily on him. Relief mingled with the lingering tension of responsibility. He knew that in the military, vigilance was never complete, and the work of safeguarding lives was never finished. By late afternoon, the immediate threat had been fully identified and neutralized. All Apaches with defective servo lines had been grounded, and replacements were scheduled. Engineers completed their documentation, photographs cataloged for evidence, and reports submitted to the higher command. Kyle stood back, observing the activity with a quiet sense of satisfaction. The helicopters, once potential death traps, were now being prepared to fly safely. The danger had been averted. 44 lives had been saved. Captain Torres approached him again, her flight helmet under her arm, eyes steady and full of gratitude. "Kyle," she said softly, "you didn't just find a defect. You saved my team and everyone else who would have flown today." "I can't overstate that." Kyle nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Recognition was not what he sought, but hearing the acknowledgement from a pilot he respected gave him a sense of quiet accomplishment. The real reward, he realized, was knowing that his diligence had made a difference. The commanding officer finally spoke, addressing the gathered team. "Today, we learned an important lesson about vigilance, accountability, and courage," he said, his voice carrying over the hangar. "Sergeant Mercer's actions demonstrate that attention to detail and the courage to speak up when something seems wrong can save lives. Let this be a reminder to all of us that safety is paramount, and no concern is too small to investigate." His gaze lingered on Kyle, a subtle acknowledgement of the life-saving importance of one mechanic's diligence. As the day drew to a close, the hangar quieted once more. Mechanics cleaned their tools, engineers completed their reports, and the remaining helicopters were secured for further maintenance. Kyle sat on a low crate, exhausted, reflecting on the day's events. The tiny crack in the servo line, barely noticeable, had been enough to threaten the lives of 44 people. But his attention to detail, persistence, and courage had prevented that disaster. The weight of responsibility had been immense, but it had also affirmed his purpose. Kyle knew this was only the beginning. Inspections would continue, parts would be replaced, and protocols would be reviewed. But for today, he had acted decisively, and lives had been spared. The realization settled over him with quiet intensity. He had been the one to see the danger, the one to speak up, and the one to ensure that precaution triumphed over complacency. In the silence of the hangar, Kyle Mercer understood something fundamental. Sometimes, the difference between life and death comes down to vigilance, courage, and the willingness to act when others hesitate. The day after the grounding of the Apaches began with a tense hush across Fort Hood. Word of the mechanical defect had spread quickly through the chain of command. For a moment, the base felt different, quiet, almost fragile, as though everyone was holding their breath. Kyle Mercer, the quiet mechanic who had spotted the tiny but deadly flaw, now found himself at the center of attention, though he didn't seek it. He was exhausted, but there was no time to rest. Investigations and inspections demanded his presence, and every step he took was measured, deliberate, and scrutinized. Engineers and commanders convened in the hangar's conference room, a stark, utilitarian space filled with charts, maintenance records, and tense faces. Kyle was seated at the long table, flanked by Captain Rachel Torres and several senior engineers. Across from him sat the commanding officer, his expression guarded. The room buzzed with a mixture of tension, urgency, and unspoken admiration for the young mechanic whose vigilance had prevented disaster. Kyle tried to remain calm, though his stomach churned with the weight of expectation. This was not just a routine inspection. This was a reckoning. The first order of business was a full review of the defective batch of servo lines. Engineers detailed their findings. The microscopic cracks Kyle had noticed were not isolated incidents, but part of a systemic flaw in the contractor's production process. The material had been compromised, prone to stress fractures under operational loads. Kyle watched quietly as technical details were explained, each word confirming what he already knew. His attention to detail had uncovered a problem that could have ended lives. 44 lives. 44 futures. 44 families. The thought pressed down on him, almost suffocating in its intensity. As the engineers discussed the technical ramifications, the commanding officer turned his attention to Kyle. "Sergeant Mercer, your actions yesterday were unusual," he began, his tone carefully measured. "You escalated an issue that some of your peers and supervisors might have overlooked or even dismissed. Can you walk us through your process?" Kyle nodded, taking a deep breath. He recounted his observations, the tiny shimmer of hydraulic fluid, the trace of the leak along the servo line, and the pattern of past false alarms that had been dismissed. Every step was precise, methodical, and factual. He knew that clarity and accuracy were the only weapons he had in this room. Captain Torres added her perspective, her voice calm but firm. Sergeant Mercer's diligence prevented a catastrophe. The defective servo lines could have failed mid-flight during formation exercises. Each helicopter carries multiple personnel. One failure could have set off a chain reaction with devastating consequences. We owe him and the maintenance team for their vigilance. Her words carried weight, commanding the room's attention. Kyle felt a quiet swell of relief, not for recognition, but for the acknowledgement that the danger had been real and immediate, and that he had been right. The engineers and commanders worked through the morning, documenting every defect, identifying which helicopters were affected, and coordinating replacements. The exercise scheduled for that day was canceled, a rare but necessary disruption. Kyle moved between the engineers, answering questions, confirming measurements, and providing additional insight from his inspections. The intensity of the work left him little room for reflection, but every confirmation of a defect felt like a small victory. Every helicopter grounded safely meant that 44 lives had been spared. By mid-afternoon, the news of the defective parts, and Kyle's role in discovering them, had reached higher levels of command. Messages of inquiry and commendation flowed through the base. Some officers expressed concern that the defect had made it past routine inspections. Others quietly acknowledged the rare courage required to escalate the issue despite potential pushback. Kyle's reputation shifted rapidly. Where he had once been known as meticulous, some might say obsessive, he was now recognized as someone whose vigilance and courage could not be ignored. Yet, the attention came with scrutiny. Staff Sergeant Doyle, who had initially dismissed Kyle's concerns, had to explain the chain of decisions that allowed the defect to be overlooked. Internal reviews questioned procedures, past inspections, and compliance with maintenance protocols. Kyle felt a mix of unease and validation. While he had saved lives, the bureaucratic machinery of the Army now demanded explanations, accountability, and thorough documentation. It was exhausting, but it was necessary. The lessons from yesterday's crisis could prevent future disasters. Kyle's thoughts often returned to the pilots. Captain Torres and her team had trusted his judgment, paused the exercise, and ultimately followed his lead. The gravity of that trust settled over him like a weight he couldn't shrug off. Every pilot walking the tarmac, every crew member boarding the helicopter for subsequent flights, was alive because he had refused to ignore a faint shimmer of hydraulic fluid. His meticulousness had transformed from obsession to life-saving precision. He realized, for the first time, that his work carried consequences far beyond his own expectations. By evening, the initial investigations were complete, and the immediate danger had been neutralized. Mechanics and engineers had replaced defective lines, verified the integrity of all critical components, and submitted detailed reports to higher command. The base had avoided disaster, but the lessons lingered in the air like an unspoken warning. Vigilance, courage, and attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. Kyle Mercer had lived that lesson and had ensured that others would learn from it too. Captain Torres approached him as the sun set over the hangar, casting long, orange shadows across the tarmac. Her helmet tucked under one arm, she smiled quietly. "Kyle," she said softly, "I hope you understand what you've done. You didn't just prevent the malfunction, you saved lives. You've set a standard here that no one will forget." Kyle nodded, feeling a surge of quiet satisfaction mixed with lingering exhaustion. He didn't seek recognition, but knowing that the pilots were safe brought him a deep sense of fulfillment. Later, as the hangar grew quiet and mechanics cleaned up their tools, Kyle reflected on the events of the past 48 hours. The fear, tension, and responsibility he had carried weighed heavily, but so did the knowledge that his diligence had mattered. In a world filled with machines, schedules, and protocols, it was sometimes the quietest voice, the one that noticed the smallest detail, that could make the greatest difference. Kyle understood that, for today, his actions had been life-saving. For the first time, he allowed himself a measure of pride. That night, as he sat alone in the dimly lit hangar, Kyle reviewed his notes and photographs one final time. Each detail, each measurement, each observation had played a role in preventing disaster. 44 lives had been spared, 44 futures intact. And while the attention and commendations might come later, the real reward was the quiet knowledge that he had acted when it mattered most. Kyle Mercer, the quiet mechanic, had made a difference that could never be measured in accolades, only in lives saved. The morning of the medal ceremony dawned crisp and clear over Fort Hood. The base buzzed with a sense of solemn anticipation, a mix of pride and respect permeating the air. Soldiers in crisp uniforms lined the parade grounds, and flags fluttered lightly in the breeze. At the center of it all stood Kyle Mercer, the quiet mechanic whose diligence had prevented catastrophe. Today, for the first time, his actions would be formally recognized before the entire base. He stood tall, though inwardly, nerves rattled him like the rotors of a helicopter. Captain Rachel Torres was at his side, her presence a quiet anchor. She had insisted on attending, knowing that Kyle's role in saving 44 lives was pivotal. "This is for you, Kyle," she said softly, adjusting the collar of his uniform. "Not for what you did for us, but for what you did for everyone." Kyle nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. Recognition had never been his goal. He sought only to do his duty. Yet, standing there, he understood that the acknowledgement symbolized something far greater than personal pride. It represented the importance of courage, attention, and speaking up when it mattered most. The commanding officer stepped forward, microphone in hand, addressing the gathered personnel. "Today, we honor Sergeant Kyle Mercer, a mechanic whose vigilance and courage prevented what could have been a catastrophic accident. Through his meticulous attention to detail and his unwavering commitment to safety, he identified a critical defect in a series of H-64 Apache helicopters. His actions directly saved 44 lives. Sergeant Mercer embodies the principle that duty and courage are not confined to the battlefield, but can manifest in the quietest moments of vigilance." Applause rippled through the assembled soldiers. Some clapped with unreserved admiration, while others, mechanics and engineers alike, nodded in solemn acknowledgement. Kyle felt a surge of emotion rise within him, a mixture of relief, pride, and humility. He had never sought glory, yet standing there, he realized the significance of his actions. Every meticulous inspection, every hour spent documenting tiny anomalies, had mattered. Every life that continued because of his vigilance was the true reward. As the commanding officer continued, he pinned a commendation medal to Kyle's chest. The polished metal glinted in the sunlight, heavy with symbolic weight. "Sergeant Mercer," the officer said, voice carrying over the parade ground, "your courage to act when others might have hesitated exemplifies the very best of our service. You have set a standard for all who follow. We are grateful for your dedication, and we recognize the lives your actions have preserved." Kyle stood silently, absorbing the words, feeling the medal's weight against his uniform. 44 lives, each one represented by the faces of pilots, co-pilots, and crew members who had trusted his work without ever knowing it. The thought pressed against him, a quiet reminder of the responsibility inherent in every bolt tightened, every hydraulic line inspected, every decision made in the hangar. The medal was not just recognition. It was a symbol of the lives saved through diligence, courage, and the refusal to remain silent. Captain Torres stepped forward to shake his hand. "Kyle," she said, voice steady but warm, "you did something extraordinary. Not for medals, not for recognition, but for every person who would have been in those helicopters. Remember that's the true measure of what you've done." Kyle nodded again, the words sinking deeply. For him, the significance wasn't the ceremony, the applause, or even the medal itself. It was the knowledge that his vigilance had mattered, that he had acted when it truly counted. After the ceremony, the base buzzed with discussion. Mechanics and pilots alike recounted the events, marveling at how one quiet, observant man had changed the course of what could have been disaster. Kyle walked through the hangar later that afternoon, now familiar with the bustling activity, yet seeing everything differently. Each helicopter, each instrument panel, each line of hydraulic fluid reminded him of the fragile balance of safety. 44 lives had been spared, yes, but he understood that vigilance could not waver. This was a lesson not just for him, but for the entire base. That evening, Kyle sat alone in the hangar, the medal resting in his hand. He reflected on the events that had brought him here. The initial discovery of the hydraulic leak, the dismissal by his supervisor, the tense hours of inspections, and the ultimate confirmation of the defect. Each moment had tested him, his patience, his courage, his attention to detail. But through it all, he had acted decisively, guided by a quiet sense of responsibility. The medal in his hand was a token, but the lives saved were the true measure of his actions. He thought about Captain Torres, the pilots, and the engineers who had supported him once the defect was confirmed. Their trust had been critical, yet he knew that the chain of events had begun with him noticing something others might have overlooked. He realized that courage wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was persistence in the face of doubt. Sometimes it was simply speaking up when everything in your training and conscience tells you that lives depend on it. As the sun set over Fort Hood, Kyle placed the medal on a nearby workbench alongside his tools. It was not a trophy, but a reminder that diligence, attention to detail, and moral courage could have consequences far beyond oneself. 44 lives had been preserved because he had noticed the shimmer of hydraulic fluid, documented the defect, and insisted on action. And while the base would move on to other exercises, other missions, and other challenges, Kyle knew the significance of what had occurred. One quiet mechanic had made a difference that day, and that difference would echo in the lives of 44 people and their families. That night, Kyle walked past the lined-up Apaches, now safe and ready for flight. The engines were silent, but in his mind, he could hear the quiet hum of rotors, a rhythm of life preserved. Each aircraft represented vigilance, trust, and the fragile balance of duty and courage. He touched the fuselage lightly, feeling the metal beneath his fingers, and whispered to himself, "We're still here. Because I didn't look away." It was a small moment, unobserved by others, but profoundly significant. In that quiet, Kyle understood something essential about service, duty, and life. Heroism is not always about combat or battlefields. Sometimes it's about seeing what others don't, refusing to be silent, and acting decisively when every second counts. 44 lives, a statistic to some, were for him living proof that attention, courage, and integrity mattered. Kyle Mercer, the quiet mechanic in the hangar, had ensured that the invisible line between life and death had held firm, and that the world of those 44 souls continued, uninterrupted, because of him. Weeks had passed since the critical discovery of the defective servo lines. Yet the impact of that single action continued to reverberate across Fort Hood. The base operated as usual on the surface helicopters lifted into the sky. Pilots executed maneuvers, and mechanics checked rotors and engines, but underneath the routine was a deepened awareness. Every soldier, engineer, and pilot knew that a quiet hero had changed the course of events, and that vigilance could never be taken for granted. Kyle Mercer walked among them, the weight of the metal on his chest lighter than the weight of responsibility he carried in his mind. The inspections had been exhaustive. Every Apache that had flown the previous year was meticulously checked for the same defect, and faulty components were replaced. Engineers praised Kyle's attention to detail, noting that the systemic flaw might have gone unnoticed without his persistence. Captain Rachel Torres personally oversaw follow-up training for pilots, emphasizing communication with maintenance crews and the importance of trusting warnings, even from those in the background. Kyle's actions had transformed protocols, fostering a culture where caution and observation were valued as much as speed and efficiency. Kyle, however, remained modest. He returned to the hangar each morning with the same quiet diligence he always had, checking lines, inspecting rotors, and documenting even the smallest anomalies. Peers who once teased him now sought his advice, acknowledging that his meticulousness was a strength, not a quirk. Mechanics approached him with questions about inspection techniques, while younger soldiers listened intently to his explanations of what could happen if a defect went unnoticed. In this new environment, Kyle's vigilance became a model, a benchmark for excellence that inspired respect rather than ridicule. Despite the recognition, Kyle continued to reflect deeply on the fragility of life. 44 lives had been spared, yet he knew that every day presented new dangers, unseen until discovered. Each helicopter, each mission, each maintenance check carried the potential for disaster if overlooked. He understood that courage was not measured by medals or applause, but by consistent attention, moral fortitude, and the willingness to act when the stakes were highest. The lessons of that day had seeped into every fiber of his being, shaping not just his work, but his outlook on life. Kyle's personal growth was mirrored in the culture of the base. Pilots communicated more openly with mechanics, engineers double-checked reports, and supervisors encouraged diligence rather than dismissing concerns. The incident with the defective servo line had sparked a subtle but profound shift, the recognition that heroism sometimes comes not from bravery in battle, but from observing the small, critical details others overlook. Kyle had become the embodiment of that philosophy, a quiet sentinel whose actions had forged a new standard for safety and responsibility. One evening, Kyle returned to the hangar alone, walking past the now safe Apaches, their rotors silent in the fading light. He paused, resting a hand on the fuselage of the helicopter that had first revealed the defect. Memories of that tense day shimmering hydraulic fluid, overlooked warnings, and the fear of catastrophe flooded back. 44 lives. Families who would remain whole, soldiers who would continue their service. Kyle felt a profound sense of fulfillment, not from recognition, but from the knowledge that he had made a tangible difference. Captain Torres joined him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Kyle," she said softly, "you changed the culture here." You saved lives, yes, but you also showed us what vigilance really looks like. That lesson will stay with this base for years." Kyle nodded, understanding the truth in her words. It wasn't about medals or ceremonies. It was about the ongoing responsibility to observe, to act, and to ensure that every helicopter, every soldier, every mission was as safe as possible. Kyle's influence extended beyond the base. Lessons learned from the defective servo lines were shared with other units, and his meticulous inspection protocols were adopted as part of a broader Army-wide maintenance standard. Mechanics in other installations were trained to look for subtle signs of failure, and pilots were educated to trust the observations of their maintenance teams. Kyle's single act of courage had created a ripple effect, saving lives far beyond Fort Hood, instilling a culture of vigilance, responsibility, and mutual trust across the service. Despite the accolades and institutional changes, Kyle remained grounded. He knew that vigilance required constant attention, and that complacency could undo all progress. Every day, he walked the hangar, checked the helicopters, and reviewed maintenance logs. Each small task, once tedious and routine, now carried profound significance. The helicopter lines, the pressure gauges, the microscopic checks, they were all part of a chain of life-saving actions. And Kyle understood that his role, however quiet, was vital. Months later, during a quiet evening shift, Kyle stood watching the sunset over the tarmac. Pilots were finishing exercises, their aircraft lined up and humming softly. He thought about the day he had spoken up, the tension, the fear, and the eventual relief of knowing that lives had been spared. The weight of responsibility had been immense, but it had also affirmed the purpose behind every action he took. Vigilance, courage, and attention to detail were not abstract concepts. They were life-saving imperatives. As darkness fell and the base quieted, Kyle placed his medal carefully in a drawer beside his workbench. He didn't need to wear it. The real proof of his work was in the pilots returning safely, the helicopters spinning silently in the hangar, and the culture of trust and responsibility he had helped foster. 44 lives had been saved, yes, but the legacy of vigilance, courage, and moral clarity would endure far longer than any ceremony or medal. Kyle Mercer, the quiet mechanic who had noticed the shimmer of hydraulic fluid, had become more than a soldier. He had become a symbol of the power of attention, the courage to act, and the profound impact that one individual could have in the lives of many. And though he would continue his work quietly, day after day, the echoes of that one critical decision would resonate for years to come. Every pilot who took to the sky, every mechanic who double-checked a line, every young soldier learning the importance of vigilance, carried forward the legacy Kyle had begun. The hangar was silent, save for the faint hum of idling engines. Kyle stood alone, looking out over the tarmac, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. He thought of the 44 lives spared, the families unaffected, the pilots still soaring safely above the horizon. And he whispered to himself, almost in reverence, "We're still here. Because I didn't look away. Because I acted when it mattered." In that moment, Kyle Mercer understood the enduring truth of his journey. True courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, meticulous, and unseen, but it can save the world.